Officer Travis Daniels' flashlight beam cut through the thick Mississippi darkness on Highway 49 just outside Meridian, illuminating the terrified face of Marcus Thompson, a black man in his 50s sitting rigidly in the driver's seat of a 10-year-old Toyota Camry, with his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2 like his life depended on perfect compliance. And Travis smiled that predatory smile he perfected over 14 years of working this exact stretch of road. The smile that said he'd already decided how this stop was going to end before he'd even run the license plate, before he'd invented the traffic violation, before he'd chosen this particular car out of the 20 others that had passed by in the last hour. License and registration, Travis drawled in that slow southern accent he exaggerated when he wanted to emphasize the power dynamic, his hand resting on his service weapon in that casual, threatening way that made it abundantly clear who had all the power here, who made the rules and who had to follow them, who could turn a simple traffic stop into a nightmare that would cost you everything you had in your wallet and leave you with nothing but the sick knowledge that there was nowhere to complain. No one who would believe your word over a police officer's. No justice for people who looked like Marcus driving through counties where cops like Travis Daniels had been running the same scheme for over a decade without consequence, without oversight, without anyone in authority caring enough to stop it. Marcus handed over his documents with steady hands that betrayed none of the fear that Travis could see in his eyes, and those eyes met Travis's through the car window with a calmness and clarity that should have warned the officer that something was different about this stop, that this particular target wasn't like the hundreds of others, that the man sitting in this unremarkable car on this humid Mississippi night in August 2023 was about to end a criminal enterprise that had stolen an estimated $2.3 million from Black and Hispanic motorists who had no recourse, no proof that would stand up against a police report, and no voice loud enough to be heard over the institutional racism and willful blindness that had protected officers like Travis from any meaningful consequences for their crimes. What Travis Daniels didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he looked at Marcus Thompson's driver's license and saw just another victim, just another number to add to his long history of theft disguised as law enforcement, was that this stop would cost him his freedom, his pension, his reputation, his marriage, his standing in the community where he'd lived his entire life, and would trigger a federal investigation that would expose not just his crimes, but the largest systematic civil asset forfeiture abuse scheme in Mississippi history, bringing down 6 other officers, 2 sheriffs, and ultimately changing the legal landscape for civil rights and police accountability across the entire Fifth Circuit. Travis walked back to his patrol car with Marcus's license and registration, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder of Highway 49, the cicadas screaming their summer song in the pine trees that lined both sides of this dark stretch of road that had become his personal hunting ground over the past 14 years. He ran Marcus's information through the system, the computer screen casting a blue glow on his face as he waited for results he already knew would come back clean, because Travis didn't pull over criminals, didn't stop people with warrants or suspended licenses, didn't target actual lawbreakers because that would complicate everything, would create paperwork and court dates and scrutiny he didn't want. No, Travis pulled over working people, people driving decent but not expensive cars, people who were clearly from out of town based on their license plates, people who would have cash on them from traveling, because that's what people carried when they were going to buy something or pay someone or help family. People who would be carrying the kinds of amounts that wouldn't destroy them financially, but would be significant enough to make the stop worthwhile for him, usually between $2,000 and $8,000. The sweet spot he'd identified through years of practice and refinement of his criminal technique. Marcus's license showed an address in Jackson, about 90 miles southwest, and Travis's experienced predatory eye had already cataloged everything that made this stop profitable during his initial approach to the vehicle. The laptop bag on the passenger seat suggesting business travel, the nice but not flashy watch on Marcus's wrist visible when he'd handed over his documents, the well-maintained car that suggested financial stability, the out-of-county plates that meant this person was just passing through and wouldn't have local connections or knowledge of how to fight back. The signs of someone who had money but wasn't wealthy enough to have lawyers on retainer or political connections that could cause problems. Travis had developed a sixth sense over 14 years for identifying the perfect targets, the people who sat in that vulnerable middle space between poverty and wealth, people who had enough to make robbing them worthwhile, but not enough to effectively fight back against the vast machinery of the legal system that would grind them down if they tried to contest what he was about to do. The license came back exactly as Travis knew it would. Clean, no warrants, no previous arrests. A perfectly law-abiding citizen who was about to learn that following the law meant nothing when you encountered a cop who decided you were going to be a victim. Travis sat in his patrol car for another 3 minutes, letting Marcus sweat, letting the anxiety build. A psychological tactic he'd learned increased compliance and made people more likely to voluntarily provide information they shouldn't, more likely to consent to searches they should refuse, more likely to just accept what was happening to them because the alternative of fighting back seemed too exhausting, too expensive, too unlikely to result in justice. He watched Marcus in the rearview mirror, watched him sitting perfectly still in his car, hands visible on the steering wheel, doing everything exactly right, following every unwritten rule about how black men were supposed to behave during traffic stops if they wanted to survive the encounter. And Travis felt that familiar mixture of power and contempt that had sustained him through hundreds of these stops, the sense that he was smarter than these people, that he'd figured out a system that let him take their money legally, that they were too ignorant or too scared to effectively resist. Travis approached the car again, this time with his ticket book out and his body camera supposedly recording, though he'd long ago mastered the art of positioning himself and his hand in ways that obscured crucial moments. And he developed a reliable relationship with the department's evidence technician, who understood that sometimes footage got corrupted or accidentally deleted, and who benefited from the overtime and equipment purchases that civil asset forfeiture funds made possible. "Mr. Thompson, do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Travis asked, his voice carrying that false courtesy that barely masked the threat underneath, the tone that said this was a test and there were only wrong answers. Marcus's response came in a voice that was calm, measured, educated, the kind of articulate professional tone that Travis had learned to recognize and resent, the voice of someone who thought being well-spoken would protect them, who thought playing by the rules and being respectful would matter when the person enforcing the rules was fundamentally corrupt, and the system was designed to give him every advantage. "No, officer, I don't," Marcus said, his words precise and carefully chosen. "I was traveling at 53 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone. All my vehicle lights are functioning properly as I checked them before beginning my journey. I used my turn signal when I changed lanes approximately 2 miles back to pass a slower vehicle, and I haven't violated any traffic laws that I'm aware of." The specificity of Marcus's response, the clear indication that he'd been paying careful attention to his driving and knew his rights, would have warned a less arrogant cop that this might not be an easy mark. But Travis had so much practice and so much confidence built on 14 years of successfully executing this scheme that he dismissed the warning signs, convinced himself that this was just another educated victim who would ultimately be as powerless as all the others when faced with the institutional weight of law enforcement and a legal system that presumed police officers told the truth. Travis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the precision of Marcus's response, at the implicit challenge in those carefully documented facts. But he had an answer prepared for this kind of resistance because he'd encountered it before and he'd always prevailed, had always found a way to manufacture the justification he needed, because the system was designed to give him the benefit of the doubt and give people like Marcus nothing but the impossible burden of proving a negative. of proving they hadn't done something when the only evidence was a police officer's word against theirs. "Well, Mr. Thompson, I clocked you at 62 miles per hour on my radar, which is 7 miles over the posted limit, and more importantly, I observed your vehicle weaving between lanes in a manner consistent with impaired or distracted driving." Travis lied smoothly, the false words coming easily after years of practice. The same basic script he'd used on dozens of stops with only minor variations to match the specific circumstances. Lies that would be documented in his report, and that would stand up in court because judges and juries almost always believed police testimony over civilian testimony, especially when the civilian was black and the cop was white, and the setting was rural Mississippi, where certain assumptions about credibility were baked into the culture. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle and perform a field sobriety test, Mr. Thompson," Travis continued, watching Marcus's face for the reaction he usually saw at this point. The resignation or fear or anger that confirmed his power, that reminded him why he loved this particular aspect of his job beyond even the financial benefit. The sense of dominance over people who thought they were better than him because they had college degrees or professional jobs or proper grammar. But Marcus's expression remained controlled, neutral, giving Travis nothing to feed on. And there was something in the older man's eyes that made Travis slightly uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Some quality of assessment and judgment that felt wrong for a victim, that felt more like someone gathering evidence than someone being victimized. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice still level and calm, "I haven't been drinking alcohol or using any substances. I'm happy to take a breathalyzer test right here, right now, which will show my blood alcohol content is 0. I'm also happy to show you the dashcam footage from my vehicle that will demonstrate I wasn't weaving between lanes, and that my speed never exceeded 54 miles per hour during my entire journey on this highway." The mention of a dashcam made Travis pause for just a fraction of a second, made him recalculate his approach. But he'd dealt with dashcams before on maybe a dozen stops, had learned that footage could be challenged, that he could position his body to block crucial angles, that he could claim the footage was edited or incomplete, that judges still generally believed his testimony, even when video evidence contradicted it because they didn't want to believe that police officers routinely lied under oath. Because accepting that truth would undermine too many convictions and expose too many injustices. Travis had also learned that mentioning dashcams or knowing your rights often meant the person was going to be difficult, was going to contest the seizure, was going to make his life slightly more complicated. But that difficulty rarely translated into actual consequences for him, because the legal deck was so thoroughly stacked in law enforcement's favor when it came to civil asset forfeiture. And because most people eventually gave up when they realized how expensive and time-consuming it was to fight the government for money the government had already spent. "Step out of the car, Mr. Thompson. Now." Travis's hand moved back to his service weapon, a gesture he'd calibrated precisely over years of practice to be just threatening enough to compel compliance, without being so overtly aggressive that it would look bad on camera. The implicit promise of violence that didn't need to be spoken, because everyone understood what happened to black men who didn't comply with police orders quickly enough, who moved wrong or said the wrong thing or showed insufficient deference to authority. The ever-present threat of escalation that turned every traffic stop into a potentially deadly encounter, and that gave Travis enormous leverage over people who just wanted to survive the interaction and get home to their families. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt with slow, deliberate movements, his hands always visible, everything done with the careful precision of someone who understood that survival required perfect compliance, even when that compliance was being demanded unjustly, even when every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that this stop was manufactured, that this officer had targeted him for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic safety and everything to do with the color of his skin and the opportunity for theft. Marcus stepped out of the Toyota Camry and stood beside his vehicle, his hands at his sides but visible, his posture non-threatening, his face composed despite what Travis interpreted as controlled anger simmering beneath that calm exterior. Travis immediately began the field sobriety test. The walk-in turn first, watching as Marcus performed it flawlessly. Heel to toe for 9 steps. Turn, heel to toe for 9 steps back, arms at his sides. Perfect balance. No stumbling or swaying or any of the indicators that would suggest impairment. Then the one-leg stand. Marcus raising his right foot approximately 6 inches off the ground and holding it steady for 30 seconds while counting aloud. No wobbling, no putting his foot down, no using his arms for balance. Another perfect performance. Finally, the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, Travis holding his pen and moving it slowly left and right, while watching Marcus's eyes track it smoothly with no jerking movements that would indicate intoxication. The third perfect test result in a row, objective evidence that Marcus was completely sober, evidence that would be documented, and then ignored because Travis had already decided what narrative he was going to write in his report. Mr. Thompson, based on my 14 years of training and experience in identifying impaired drivers, I believe you are currently under the influence of a controlled substance, possibly marijuana or methamphetamine, which is affecting your motor skills and judgment in ways that may not be apparent through standard field sobriety testing, but which I can detect based on subtle behavioral cues and my extensive background in drug recognition, Travis said. The words rolling out in that official-sounding language he'd perfected, language that sounded authoritative and professional, and that would read well in a police report even though it was complete fabrication. Meaningless jargon designed to create the appearance of probable cause where none actually existed. This was the second part of his well-rehearsed script, the escalation that would justify the search he was about to conduct, the search that would discover cash that Travis would characterize as suspicious regardless of how legitimate it obviously was, cash that he would seize under Mississippi's civil asset forfeiture statutes that allowed police to take property suspected of being connected to criminal activity without ever charging anyone with a crime, without ever having to prove in court that any crime had actually occurred. I'm going to search your vehicle for contraband, Mr. Thompson, Travis continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from knowing the system would back him up, that his word would be believed over Marcus's, that nothing Marcus said or did at this point would prevent what was about to happen. If you're currently in possession of any illegal drugs, weapons, or large amounts of cash that might be proceeds from illegal activity, I'm advising you to tell me now before I find them, because cooperation can help your situation. This was Travis's favorite moment, the moment when innocent people who had nothing to hide, and who'd been raised to respect authority and believe that honesty was rewarded, would often voluntarily reveal that they were carrying cash, trying to be helpful, trying to prove they had nothing to hide, not understanding that they were handing a thief exactly the information he needed to rob them legally, not realizing that the system they'd been taught to trust was about to victimize them, and then blame them for their own victimization. Marcus's expression remained neutral, his dark eyes steady on Travis's face with that same unsettling quality of calm assessment that made the officer increasingly uncomfortable even as his confidence in the outcome remained unshaken. "Officer Daniels," Marcus said, and Travis registered with some surprise that Marcus had either caught his name from his badge or remembered it from his initial identification at the start of the stop. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. I know my Fourth Amendment rights under the United States Constitution. You do not have probable cause to search my car based on field sobriety tests that I clearly passed with perfect performance, and you do not have reasonable suspicion that I'm carrying contraband based on any legitimate observations during this traffic stop. Any search you conduct without my consent and without probable cause will be a violation of my constitutional rights, and any evidence or property you seize as a result of that illegal search will be subject to suppression and will expose you and your department to civil liability under Section 1983. But Travis had heard people cite the Constitution before, had heard mentions of the Fourth Amendment and illegal searches and civil rights, had listened to people threaten lawsuits and complaints and consequences that never materialized because the system protected him, and people like Marcus had no real power to challenge it, not in Lauderdale County. Not on Highway 49 at 1040 on a Thursday night where he was the only authority that mattered and where backup would support whatever story he told because that's what cops did. They backed each other up even when everyone knew the official story was a lie. "I don't need your consent, Mr. Thompson," Travis said, his voice hardening slightly, the false courtesy dropping away to reveal the threat underneath. "I have probable cause based on your impaired driving, your failed field sobriety tests which I determined showed subtle signs of impairment that you apparently don't recognize, and your nervous, defensive behavior throughout this stop, which in my training and experience indicates you're hiding something, probably drugs or drug money, and that gives me every legal right to search your vehicle under established law." Every word was a lie, every justification a fabrication, every legal claim a distortion of actual law, but it was a distortion that would hold up in court because Travis had 14 years of practice making his lies sound like professional law enforcement judgment. 14 years of judges accepting his testimony as credible and authoritative. 14 years of defense attorneys being unable to effectively cross-examine him because he'd learned all the right phrases and developed a demeanor of absolute confidence that juries found convincing. And because the legal system wanted to believe that police officers were honest and that people accused of crimes were guilty, even when the crime was nothing more than driving while black through a county where a corrupt cop needed to make his monthly quota of seized assets. Travis returned to Marcus's car and began his search, methodical and thorough, going through the glove compartment first where he found only the vehicle registration and insurance documents and an owner's manual. Nothing useful, nothing incriminating, nothing he could use to justify this stop beyond the manufactured narrative he'd already created. He moved to the center console, finding only a phone charger and some loose change, then checked under the seats, finding nothing but accumulated dust and a forgotten pen, his frustration building slightly because some stops turned out to be dry holes. Some targets didn't have cash or had hidden it too well or simply weren't carrying anything worth seizing, and those stops were wastes of his time, interruptions to his profitable routine that meant he'd need to find another target to make his night worthwhile. But then Travis opened the laptop bag on the passenger seat, the nice leather bag that had first caught his attention and marked this car as worth stopping. And there it was, exactly what he'd been looking for, what he'd expected to find based on 14 years of profiling and pattern recognition, and understanding that business travelers often carried cash. $3,200 in 20, 50, and $100 bills, neatly organized in a bank envelope with Marcus's name written on it in someone else's handwriting, along with receipts that clearly documented this, was payment for consulting services rendered, an invoice on professional letterhead showing the breakdown of hours and fees, everything legitimate and documented and provably legal. None of which would matter because Travis had long ago learned that the legality of the cash was irrelevant under civil asset forfeiture law. Travis held up the envelope of cash, watching Marcus's face carefully for the resignation he usually saw at this point in the process, the defeated acceptance that this was happening and there was nothing they could do to stop it, that they were about to be robbed by someone wearing a badge and the system would call it justice. But Marcus's expression didn't show resignation. Instead, there was something that looked almost like satisfaction, like confirmation of something he'd expected, like a test that had just produced the exact result he'd been predicting. And that reaction was so wrong, so contrary to every other stop Travis had conducted, that for the first time in years, he felt a genuine flicker of doubt about whether he'd made a mistake, whether this particular target was different in ways he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. "That's quite a lot of cash to be carrying, Mr. Thompson," Travis said, falling back on his script because the script had always worked before, because doubt was weakness and weakness was dangerous in this line of work, both the legitimate aspects and the criminal ones. "Where did this money come from? And why are you carrying it in cash instead of using normal banking methods like legitimate business people do?" The question was designed to sound reasonable, to make carrying cash seem inherently suspicious, to shift the burden onto Marcus to prove his innocence rather than requiring Travis to prove guilt, which was exactly how civil asset forfeiture worked, a complete inversion of the normal presumption of innocence that applied in criminal cases, but somehow didn't apply when the government was taking your property. Marcus's voice remained steady, though Travis could now clearly hear the controlled anger underneath, the fury of someone being victimized who had to maintain composure because showing anger would be characterized as aggressive behavior, as resistance, as justification for whatever came next. "Officer Daniels, that money is payment for consulting work I completed this week for a client in Mobile, Alabama. The receipts documenting the legitimate nature of this income are in the same envelope with the cash. The invoice showing the contract and the work performed is also right there in the laptop bag. My client preferred to pay in cash for accounting reasons related to their small business, which is completely legal. I'm traveling home to Jackson tonight to deposit this money in my bank account tomorrow morning during business hours. I'm going to have to seize this money as suspected proceeds from drug trafficking," Travis said, his hands already reaching for the civil asset forfeiture forms he kept in his patrol car, the pre-printed forms that made this process quick and efficient, that he'd filled out hundreds of times with only minor variations in the details, forms that shifted the burden of proof entirely onto the victim to prove their property was innocent, which required hiring lawyers and filing motions and paying court costs that often exceeded the amount seized, which meant that most people, probably 75% of Travis's victims based on his rough mental calculations, never even tried to fight it, just accepted the loss and moved on because fighting seemed futile against the combined weight of law enforcement and a legal system that presumed police officers acted in good faith. The fact that you're carrying this amount in cash instead of using checks or electronic transfers, combined with your nervous behavior and my reasonable suspicion, based on training and experience that you're involved in drug trafficking, gives me probable cause to seize these funds under Mississippi civil asset forfeiture statutes pending investigation into their source. You can contest this seizure through the court system if you believe it's improper, Travis continued, his voice taking on that false sympathetic tone that added insult to injury, that pretended this was some unfortunate but necessary procedure rather than calculated theft. The information about how to file a claim and contest the forfeiture is on the form I'm going to give you. You'll need to file within 30 days, and you'll need to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the money isn't connected to illegal activity, which you can do by hiring an attorney and presenting your case in court. For now, though, I'm seizing the cash and you're free to go. No criminal charges are being filed at this time. The last part was crucial to the scheme. The fact that Travis almost never filed criminal charges because criminal charges would require proof beyond reasonable doubt and would give the victim a public defender and would create scrutiny that might expose his tactics, whereas civil forfeiture required only the lower preponderance of evidence standard, placed the burden on the victim, and happened in civil court where most people couldn't afford representation, and where judges rubber-stamped seizures based on boilerplate police affidavits that all said essentially the same thing. Marcus took the civil asset forfeiture form that Travis handed him, read it slowly and carefully with an attention to detail that suggested legal training or at least legal knowledge, and then looked up at Travis with an expression that made the officer genuinely uncomfortable for the first time in this stop, for the first time in years of stops, an expression that carried knowledge and warning and something that looked disturbingly like pity. Like someone watching another person make a catastrophic mistake and knowing exactly how it would end. "Officer Daniels," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying weight that Travis couldn't quite interpret, "I want to make sure I understand the situation clearly. You pulled me over claiming I was speeding and weaving, claims that are contradicted by my dashcam footage. You administered field sobriety tests that I passed perfectly. You searched my vehicle despite my explicit refusal to consent. You found completely legitimate money with full documentation of its legal source. And now you're seizing that money anyway based solely on your assertion that carrying cash is suspicious. Is that an accurate summary of what just happened here?" Travis felt that flicker of doubt again, stronger this time, because Marcus's summary was accurate and damning and sounded like someone building a legal record, like someone who knew exactly what questions to ask and how to document what was happening. But Travis pushed the doubt away because he'd heard similar challenges before, and they'd never amounted to anything, had never resulted in consequences beyond maybe having to return the seized money months later with grudging apologies about mistakes in the process. And even that happened rarely because most people gave up long before their cases got to that point. "That's correct, Mr. Thompson. I'm conducting a lawful seizure based on probable cause. If you have proof the money is legitimate, you can present that proof in court. You're free to go now." Travis turned away, the conversation over as far as he was concerned, already mentally categorizing this stop as successful, $3,200 that would eventually benefit his department and indirectly benefit him through equipment purchases and overtime opportunities. Another transaction in the long, profitable history of his 14-year crime spree. "Officer Daniels," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Travis turn back despite his intention to end this interaction. "You've made a very serious mistake tonight. I'm going to leave now as you've indicated I'm free to go. And I'm going to strongly advise you to contact a lawyer before you submit your report on this incident, before you deposit that money into evidence, before you make any statements to anyone about what happened here tonight. What you've done is going to have consequences that I don't think you've fully considered." The words should have sounded like empty threats, like the kind of impotent bluster Travis had heard from dozens of victims who wanted to salvage some dignity from their humiliation, who wanted to pretend they had power they didn't actually have, who needed to believe that justice existed even as they were experiencing its absence. But something in the way Marcus said it, the calm certainty rather than angry bravado, the specific legal phrasing about submitting reports and making statements, made Travis feel cold despite the humid Mississippi heat, made him wonder for the first time if maybe he'd missed something crucial, if maybe this stop was different in ways that would matter. But the feeling passed as Marcus got back in his Toyota Camry, started the engine, and drove away into the Mississippi night, his taillights disappearing around a curve in Highway 49, and Travis stood there with $3,200 in his hand, money he would photograph and document and place in an evidence bag and log into the system, and eventually see redistributed through the civil asset forfeiture process. And the familiar routine reasserted itself. The confidence built on 14 years of getting away with this exact crime hundreds of times without meaningful consequences. The certainty that the system would protect him, because it always had. Because he was a cop and Marcus was just another black motorist who would discover that rights only mattered if someone with power cared about enforcing them. And in Lauderdale County, Mississippi, Travis was the power that mattered, and he didn't care about anything except the money. What Travis Daniels didn't know, what he couldn't have known because Marcus Thompson hadn't told him, and nothing in his driver's license or vehicle registration revealed it. What would have changed everything about how Travis approached this stop if he'd had even the slightest hint of the truth, was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just another traveling professional, wasn't just another victim in the long line of people Travis had robbed over the years, but was actually Judge Marcus Jonathan Thompson of the United States Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most powerful federal judges in the entire country, a man who had spent 32 years on the bench fighting against exactly the kind of civil rights violations and corrupt policing practices that he just experienced firsthand, a man whose rulings had shaped constitutional law across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, a man who had the knowledge, the resources, the connections, and most importantly, the authority to do something about what had just happened in ways that would devastate not just Travis Daniels, but the entire corrupt system that had enabled and protected him for 14 years. Marcus had been driving back from a conference in Mobile, where he'd been the keynote speaker on a panel about civil asset forfeiture abuse and its disproportionate impact on communities of color, where he'd cited statistics showing that Black and Hispanic motorists were 3 times more likely to have their assets seized than white motorists despite no corresponding difference in crime rates, where he discussed how civil forfeiture had become a revenue generation scheme for cash-strapped police departments rather than a legitimate law enforcement tool, where he'd argued for legal reforms that would require criminal convictions before permanent forfeiture and would eliminate the profit motive by redirecting seized assets to education and social services rather than law enforcement budgets. He'd been taking Highway 49 instead of Interstate 20 specifically because he'd read reports about civil asset forfeiture abuse in Lauderdale County, had seen the statistics showing that this county seized more assets per capita than almost anywhere else in Mississippi, had suspected that officers were systematically targeting minority motorists, and had wanted to see the situation firsthand, had wanted to experience what so many people had described in court testimony and victim statements, had deliberately made himself a target to gather the evidence he'd need to do something about a problem that had persisted for far too long. Marcus had installed a dashcam in his car specifically for this trip, a high-quality camera that recorded in high definition with audio, that saved footage to the cloud in real time so it couldn't be confiscated or destroyed, that had captured every moment of his stop from the time Travis's lights came on behind him until the moment he'd driven away without his money. He'd had his phone recording audio in his pocket the entire time, backup documentation of every word Travis had said, every lie about speeding and weaving and failed sobriety tests, every illegal step in the civil asset forfeiture process that Marcus knew intimately from dozens of cases he'd reviewed over his decades on the bench. He deliberately avoided mentioning his judicial position because he wanted to document what would have happened to anyone else in his position, to any regular Black motorist who didn't have federal judge credentials to flash, to any of the hundreds of people Travis had victimized over the years who had no special status or protection or recourse against this kind of state-sanctioned theft. Now, as Marcus drove toward Jackson, toward his chambers in the federal courthouse, toward the secure phone he would use to call the FBI's Civil Rights Division before the sun rose, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at what had just happened to him and fury at imagining it happening to people without his resources. Satisfaction that he'd successfully documented exactly what he'd suspected was happening on this highway. Grief that his assumptions about systemic racism and policing had been confirmed so perfectly, and a grim determination to use his authority to ensure that Travis Daniels' 14-year career of crime would end with the kind of justice that had been denied to all his previous victims. Marcus had seen Travis's type before in countless cases. The corrupt cop who convinced himself he was just working the system, who rationalized theft as creative law enforcement, who targeted vulnerable populations because he knew they were least likely to fight back, who existed and thrived because good cops looked the other way and bad systems rewarded the wrong incentives, and qualified immunity protected government officials from accountability for constitutional violations they committed. To understand how Officer Travis Daniels became the kind of cop who would rob innocent people for 14 years without apparent conscience or fear of consequences, you had to go back to 2009, to a sweltering June day when Travis was a 24-year-old rookie officer fresh from the police academy. Idealistic in the way young cops often were, genuinely believing he was joining a noble profession, wanting to serve and protect the community where he'd grown up, carrying none of the cynicism or corruption that would later define his career. Travis's field training officer during those first crucial months was a veteran cop named William "Bill" Henderson, a 53-year-old sergeant with 28 years on the force, a man who was respected by fellow officers and feared by the black community in ways Travis wouldn't understand until much later. A man who would teach Travis not just how to be a police officer, but how to be a criminal with a badge. How to use the authority of law enforcement to victimize the people it was supposed to protect. It was Bill Henderson who conducted Travis's first civil asset forfeiture stop, who showed him how the process worked by pulling over an elderly black woman named Dorothy Williams, who was driving a 15-year-old Buick through Lauderdale County on her way to buy a used car from a private seller in Hattiesburg. Bill had manufactured a broken taillight violation even though Dorothy's lights were working fine, had claimed to smell marijuana even though Dorothy had never used drugs in her 72 years of life, had searched her car and found exactly what he'd been looking for. $5,000 in cash that Dorothy had saved over 2 years of working as a housekeeper. Money she'd withdrawn from her bank account that very morning. Money she'd been so proud to have saved. Money that represented her independence and her ability to finally replace her dying car that broke down twice a month and left her stranded. Bill had seized that money with practiced efficiency while Dorothy cried and begged him not to take it, explaining that it was her life savings, that she had the bank withdrawal slip to prove where it came from, that she needed it to buy the car, none of which mattered to Bill, who smiled that same predatory smile Travis would later perfect and told Dorothy she could contest the seizure in court if she wanted to waste her time trying. Travis had stood there watching Dorothy's humiliation, watching this elderly woman who reminded him of his own grandmother being robbed by his training officer, and he'd felt sick, had felt like this was wrong in a fundamental way that violated everything he'd been taught about justice and protecting the vulnerable and serving with integrity. He'd said something to Bill on the drive back, something careful and respectful because Bill was his superior officer and his training officer, and had complete control over whether Travis would make it through his probationary period. Something like, "Are you sure that seizure was justified?" Bill had laughed, not unkindly, and had given Travis the speech that would corrupt him, the rationalization that would transform him from an idealistic rookie into the kind of cop who would eventually steal from hundreds of people without remorse. Bill had explained that civil asset forfeiture was a legitimate law enforcement tool, that the money they seized went into a fund that bought equipment and paid for training and benefited all the officers, that these people driving through with large amounts of cash were probably involved in drugs or illegal activity, even if they couldn't prove it, that they were really doing society a favor by taking money that was probably dirty anyway, that the courts had approved this process, so it must be legal and right, and that officers who didn't participate were naive and stupid, and missing out on benefits that their smarter colleagues enjoyed. Travis had wrestled with his conscience for perhaps a week, had thought about Dorothy Williams and whether her $5,000 ever got returned to her, had told himself he'd become a cop to help people, not to rob them. But then he'd seen Bill Henderson get a department commendation for his asset forfeiture work, had seen officers who participated in the program get better assignments and overtime opportunities, had seen that the system rewarded this behavior rather than punishing it, had seen that his fellow officers either participated or looked the other way, and slowly, gradually, through a process of rationalization and moral compromise that corrupted him degree by degree, Travis had convinced himself that civil asset forfeiture was just part of the job, just one of the perks that compensated for the low salary and the danger and the stress, just a way of taking from people who probably didn't earn their money honestly anyway, even if he couldn't prove it. And the fact that almost all his targets ended up being black or Hispanic wasn't racism in his mind, but simply statistics, simply pattern recognition, simply being smart about who to target based on who was least likely to have the resources or the social capital to fight back effectively. Travis conducted his first solo civil asset forfeiture stop 3 months into his career, pulling over a young black man driving a Honda with Texas plates, manufacturing a lane violation to justify the stop, finding $1,200 that the young man explained was money to pay his first month's rent and security deposit on an apartment in Jackson, where he was moving to start a new job. Travis seized the money, filled out the forms, documented it all properly, and experienced a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. The guilt from knowing what he'd done was morally wrong regardless of its technical legality. The exhilaration from getting away with it, from wielding power over someone who couldn't stop him, from proving to himself that he could do this, that he could be the kind of cop who bent rules and exploited systems and put his own interests ahead of the people he was supposed to serve. The guilt faded over time, over dozens of stops, over hundreds of victims, over 14 years of repetition that made the act routine, that made him stop seeing the people he robbed as individuals with stories and struggles and families, that allowed him to categorize them simply as targets or revenue sources or suspicious individuals who probably deserved what happened to them because of vague, unfalsifiable assumptions about criminality and race, and who belonged in certain spaces. By 2023, by the time Travis pulled over Marcus Thompson, Travis had conducted approximately 347 civil asset forfeiture seizures, had stolen an estimated $2.3 million from people who were overwhelmingly black or Hispanic, who were traveling through Lauderdale County without realizing they were entering a trap, who carried cash for 1,000 perfectly legitimate reasons that Travis refused to credit because acknowledging legitimacy would interfere with his profit-taking. He'd refined his technique over those 14 years, had learned to identify the perfect targets through a combination of racial profiling and assessment of economic markers, had learned exactly what language to use in his reports to create the appearance of probable cause where none existed, had learned how to position himself relative to body cameras to obscure crucial moments, had learned which judges would rubber stamp his seizures without asking difficult questions, had learned how to testify in court with confidence and false authority that juries found credible, had learned that the system would protect him as long as he didn't get too greedy or too sloppy, or attract too much attention. He'd ruined lives with casual efficiency, taking rent money from single mothers which led to evictions, taking business capital from small entrepreneurs which led to bankruptcies, taking college tuition payments from parents which forced their children to drop out, taking medical bill money from families already struggling with illness, taking life savings from elderly people who'd spent years accumulating modest sums, taking everything from people who could least afford to lose anything and who had the least access to legal remedies or institutional support. 47 formal complaints had been filed against Travis Daniels over those 14 years. 47 people who'd had the courage and the resources and the knowledge to formally contest what he'd done to them. But all 47 had been dismissed or settled for fractions of what was seized, because Travis's reports always told the same story about reasonable suspicion and proper procedure and legitimate law enforcement. And because judges who saw dozens of these cases every month defaulted to believing law enforcement rather than questioning whether the system itself was fundamentally corrupt. The complaints had been red flags that anyone paying attention would have recognized as a pattern indicating systemic abuse, but nobody in authority had been paying attention, or at least nobody had cared enough to investigate. Because Travis was generating revenue that benefited the department and the county. Because his immediate supervisors protected him. Because they'd either participated in similar schemes or preferred willful ignorance to the disruption of investigating a fellow officer. Because the institutional culture of law enforcement valued loyalty over integrity and punished whistleblowers more severely than it punished misconduct. Because the legal framework of civil asset forfeiture created perverse incentives that essentially encouraged this kind of behavior while making it technically legal. The system had protected Travis Daniels for 14 years, had enabled and rewarded his crimes, had given him a badge and a gun, and qualified immunity, and the vast institutional weight of law enforcement that presumed he was acting in good faith even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Right up until the moment he pulled over a federal judge who had the authority and the knowledge and the determination to do what all of Travis's previous victims couldn't do. Bring the entire corrupt structure crashing down. Judge Marcus Thompson arrived at his chambers in the federal courthouse in Jackson at 2:30 a.m. Downloaded his dashcam footage to his secure computer, transferred the audio recording from his phone, and began drafting a formal complaint to the FBI's Civil Rights Division that would be on the desk of the special agent in charge before the sun rose. Marcus had clerked for a Supreme Court justice early in his career, had practiced civil rights law for a decade before his appointment to the federal bench, had spent 3 decades ruling on cases involving police misconduct and civil asset forfeiture and Fourth Amendment violations. And he knew exactly how to document what had happened in language that would trigger the kind of federal investigation that couldn't be dismissed or buried or delayed through the usual institutional protections that shielded corrupt cops from accountability. He included the video footage showing his speed never exceeded 54 miles per hour, and his vehicle never weaved, included the audio recording capturing Travis's lies about failed sobriety tests and reasonable suspicion, included the photographs he'd taken of his receipts, an invoice proving the legitimate source of his money, included his own affidavit describing the stop in precise legal language that identified each constitutional violation, included a demand for an immediate investigation not just into his individual case, but into the pattern of civil asset forfeiture abuse in Lauderdale County. By 6 a.m., FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison was sitting in her office in the Jackson Field office, reviewing Marcus's complaint and feeling the kind of rage that came from seeing clear evidence of civil rights violations that had apparently been ignored for years. Rachel had worked civil rights investigations for the Bureau for 12 years, had built a reputation for tenacity and integrity, had successfully prosecuted corrupt cops and abusive officials across Mississippi, and she recognized immediately that Marcus's case was the crack that could open up a much larger investigation into systematic abuse. She made 2 phone calls before 7 a.m., one to her supervisor requesting authorization to open a full investigation, one to an assistant U.S. attorney she'd worked with before named David Chen, who specialized in police corruption cases, and who would eventually prosecute Travis Daniels and his co-conspirators. By 9 a.m., a team of 4 FBI agents was pulling records from the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Department, requesting all civil asset forfeiture documentation for the past 15 years, requesting all complaints filed against Officer Travis Daniels, requesting body camera footage from all his stops, requesting his financial records to trace where his money came from, beginning the methodical process of building a case that would be so overwhelming, so thoroughly documented, that no defense attorney and no sympathetic jury and no institutional protection could save Travis from federal prison. The investigation expanded faster than anyone anticipated, because once the FBI started pulling threads, the entire corrupt system began to unravel like a cheap sweater. Special Agent Morrison discovered that Travis's pattern of civil asset forfeiture was statistically impossible to explain through legitimate law enforcement, that he'd seized cash from motorists at a rate 15 times higher than the state average, that 91% of his seizures targeted Black or Hispanic drivers despite those demographics representing only 34% of the traffic through Lauderdale County, that his body camera had mysteriously malfunctioned or been turned off during 97% of his seizures, a failure rate that couldn't possibly be coincidental, that his written reports used identical language across dozens of cases, suggesting he was copying templates rather than documenting actual observations. She found that the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Department had received over $3.1 million in civil asset forfeiture funds over the past 14 years, an amount that represented nearly 18% of their total budget, creating a massive financial incentive to continue and expand the program regardless of its legality or morality. More disturbing, Rachel Morrison discovered that Travis wasn't operating alone, that 6 other officers in Lauderdale County and 3 officers in neighboring counties were using identical tactics, targeting the same demographics, seizing similar amounts, suggesting either coordination or shared training in these illegal techniques. She found emails between officers sharing information about good hunting spots on various highways, text messages discussing which judges were most likely to approve seizures without scrutiny, communications that made clear these officers knew what they were doing was wrong and were actively conspiring to avoid detection and accountability. She found that the department's evidence technician, a civilian employee named Robert Foster who happened to be Travis's cousin, had been systematically deleting or corrupting body camera footage from civil asset forfeiture stops for years, and that he'd received irregular bonus payments that corresponded suspiciously with high-volume seizure months, suggesting he was being rewarded for his complicity in covering up evidence of misconduct. The FBI interviewed 73 people who'd filed complaints against Travis or the other officers involved in the scheme, people who'd been ignored or dismissed by local authorities, people whose stories had never been properly investigated because the investigators were the same department that benefited from the seized assets, people who'd given up on justice because the system seemed designed to deny it to them. Rachel Morrison sat in living rooms and church basements and community centers across Mississippi, listening to these victims describe experiences that were remarkably consistent: being pulled over for minor or manufactured violations, being subjected to searches without consent or probable cause, having their money seized despite providing proof it was legitimate, being told they could contest it in court knowing that legal representation would cost more than the seized amount, being made to feel like criminals even though they'd done nothing wrong, being targeted because of their race in ways that were obvious to them, but apparently invisible to the authorities who were supposed to protect them. She interviewed Dorothy Williams, now 86 years old, who still remembered Bill Henderson seizing her $5,000 14 years earlier, money she'd never gotten back despite filing a complaint, money she'd saved to buy a car that she'd never been able to replace, forcing her to eventually give up her housekeeping job because she couldn't reliably get to work. A single act of theft by a police officer that had cascaded into job loss and financial hardship, and a diminished final chapter of her life. Dorothy wept as she told her story, not because of the money, though that still hurt, but because someone was finally listening, because someone with authority finally believed her, because maybe after 14 years there would be some acknowledgement that what happened to her was wrong, some validation that she wasn't a criminal or a liar, but a victim of a system that had failed her. Rachel Morrison documented Dorothy's story and dozens of others like it, building not just a legal case, but a human record of the damage civil asset forfeiture abuse had inflicted on communities, families, individuals who'd done nothing wrong, but had the misfortune of driving through Lauderdale County while being Black or Hispanic and having some cash in their possession. 3 months after Marcus Thompson's traffic stop, 3 months of intensive investigation and evidence gathering and witness interviews and forensic accounting, FBI agents arrested Travis Daniels at his home at 6:15 a.m. on a cool November morning, charged with 18 counts of violating civil rights under color of law, 14 counts of theft of government property for stealing money that victims had unsuccessfully tried to recover through legal processes, 9 counts of wire fraud for electronic transfers of seized funds through banking systems, 6 counts of conspiracy to commit extortion, and 3 counts of obstruction of justice for destroying body camera evidence. Travis's face when the agents showed him the arrest warrant, when they read him his rights, when they placed handcuffs on his wrists and walked him out of his house while his wife and teenage daughter watched in horror, when they put him in the back of a government vehicle and drove him to federal detention, captured a complete reversal of power that was documented in the FBI's own body camera footage. A reversal that showed Travis experiencing a fraction of the fear and humiliation and powerlessness he'd inflicted on hundreds of victims over 14 years. The FBI arrested 6 other officers that same morning in coordinated raids that made clear this wasn't about one bad cop, but about systematic corruption, about an organized scheme that had infected multiple departments and required multiple prosecutions to properly address. They arrested Bill Henderson, Travis's old training officer, who'd retired 3 years earlier believing he'd gotten away with his crimes, charging him with many of the same violations Travis faced plus additional counts related to his longer criminal career. They arrested the evidence technician Robert Foster for obstruction and conspiracy. They arrested 3 officers from neighboring counties who'd participated in the same scheme. The local news cameras captured the perp walks, the images of officers in handcuffs being led away by federal agents, and those images sparked celebrations in some communities and angry defensiveness in others. The predictable division between people who'd experienced police abuse and people who couldn't believe officers would commit such crimes because they'd never been on the receiving end of state-sanctioned violence. Judge Marcus Thompson's role in triggering the investigation became public when the indictments were unsealed, and the media coverage was intense and immediate. National news networks picking up the story of a federal judge who deliberately made himself a target to expose civil asset forfeiture abuse. Legal experts debating whether his actions were appropriate or created ethical complications. Civil rights advocates celebrating his courage and his use of privilege to protect people without privilege. Police unions condemning what they characterized as entrapment, even though judges can't commit entrapment and Travis's crimes would have happened regardless of who he'd pulled over. Marcus gave carefully limited statements to the press, explaining that he'd suspected systematic abuse based on statistical patterns and victim complaints, that he'd wanted to document what was happening rather than rely on second-hand accounts, that his experience had confirmed his worst assumptions about how civil asset forfeiture was being weaponized against minority communities, and that his position as a federal judge gave him a responsibility to use his authority to protect civil rights when he encountered clear evidence of violations.